She was 8 years old, and she came alone, in the rain, carrying a jam jar full of coins. She stood at the gate of the most dangerous man in the city. The guards laughed. Then they saw her face, and they stopped laughing. She held it tight. She said the words she'd practiced the whole way there. "My father has died, but I came to pay his debt." 15 years later, she'd walk into a room full of powerful men and pay a debt again. Not with coins, with everything she'd become. And she'd save the life of the man she said those words to. But that came later. Here's where it ends, and it's why you clicked. A dying man's daughter walks into a mafia boss's house to pay a debt that could get her killed. What he does next changes both their lives. And 15 years later, when the men around him move to destroy him, that little girl walks back in. And no one's laughing now. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every one. Some debts are not paid in money, and some are not paid for years. Now let me start at the gate. The man's name was Kaito. He was the head of a family that was not made of blood, one that quietly ran a whole stretch of Tokyo. Men who feared nothing were careful around him. He had lost people, and lost the ability to be surprised by anything. Then, a child showed up at his gate with a jam jar. Her name was Aoi. Her father had been a small man. He'd run up a debt he couldn't pay. Then, an illness took him. Aoi had watched him worry about it on his deathbed. Not about dying, about the debt. So she'd made him a promise. And a promise to a child is a thing made of iron. She'd emptied every coin in the house into a jar. She'd walked 2 hours in the rain. And now she stood in front of a room full of hard men, soaked through. Shaking, she set the jar on the table. "It's not all of it," she said. "I know it's not all of it, but I'll bring the rest. I just need time. Please don't let it mean anything bad." He was sorry. He was so sorry he couldn't pay you. The men looked at each other. Some almost smiled. The way adults smile at a child who doesn't understand the world. One of them, a lieutenant named Endo, actually did laugh. "Look at this," he said. "The debt collector's here. Should we be scared?" A few of them chuckled with him. Kaito did not. He looked at the little girl, standing in a puddle of her own rainwater, holding a jar of coins that wouldn't cover a single dinner in that house. And something moved in him that had not moved in a very long time. She was terrified, and she had come anyway. She had walked into the den of the most dangerous man she knew, alone, to keep a promise to a dead man. Grown men twice her size trembled, just to stand where she stood. "Quiet," Kaito said. The room went silent instantly. He came around the table. He crouched down in front of her. The men had never seen him do that. Not for anyone. He looked at the jar. Then at her. "How old are you?" he asked. "8, she said. "Please, sir, I'll get the rest." "When did you last eat?" The question was so far from what she expected that the truth just fell out. "Yesterday." Kaito was quiet a moment. Then he did something that rearranged the room. He picked up the jar. He looked at it. He pushed it gently back across the table to her. "Your father's debt is paid," he said. "In full. Right now. Do you understand me? He owes nothing. You owe nothing." He said it loud enough for every man in the room to hear, so there could be no confusion later. "This child is under my protection. Anyone who forgets that answers to me." Aoi didn't understand. "But it's not enough money. You paid it," Kaito said. "You paid it the moment you walked through that gate. There isn't a man in this room who'd have had the courage you just showed me. Keep your coins. Buy yourself a hot meal." She stared at him. She didn't move. No one had ever been kind to her like that. Not once. Not since her father got sick. Her lip trembled. She didn't cry. She just nodded. The way brave people nod when kindness catches them off guard. Then he did the last thing anyone expected. He asked where her mother was. There was no mother. He asked who she had. There was no one. An 8-year-old, alone in the world, who'd spent her father's dying days worrying about his honor. Kaito stood up slowly. He looked at the girl for a long time. "Then you'll stay here," he said, "until we figure something better out." They never did figure something better out. She just stayed. What the men didn't understand that night, and some never would, was what had happened to their boss. Kaito had no children. He'd told himself for decades that his life had no room for softness, that a man like him couldn't afford it. And then a small, brave, soaking wet girl had shown him something he'd forgotten existed. Courage that wasn't about violence, honor that wasn't about pride, a promise kept for no reward. He'd spent his life around men who feared him. He had never once been looked at the way that child looked at him when he pushed the jar back, like he was good. So the little girl stayed, and the house, slowly, changed around her. She was given a room, then a tutor, then everything a child should have and had never had. The hard men of that house who had laughed at her at the gate learned her footsteps. The cook saved her the good sweets. The driver taught her card games. Even Endo, the one who'd mocked her, learned to keep his mouth shut. The boss's eyes went cold in a specific way whenever anyone was less than gentle with her. And Kaito was a different man in the mornings now. He'd sit with her while she did her lessons. He held his tea in both hands, a habit from being cold too often as a boy. And he listened to an 8-year-old explain her day like it was the most important briefing he'd get. He remembered her father's name and said it kindly, so she'd know the man was not forgotten. He was not soft with anyone else in the world. He was soft with her. There were things he learned to do that would have stunned his men. He learned which nightmare woke her. On the bad nights, he'd sit outside her door, in the dark, until her breathing went even again. He learned she loved the plum tree in the garden, so he had a bench put under it. For the two of them, he taught her to pour tea the old way, kneeling on the tatami, the way his own mother had, before the life took her. On her 9th birthday, a man who had never bought a gift in his life stood frozen in a toy shop for an hour. He came home with far too much of everything. She hugged him around the middle. He stood stiff as a post, not knowing what to do with his arms. Then, slowly, carefully, he hugged her back. One of his men saw it through a doorway and had to look away. It was too much, somehow, watching the hardest man they knew learn to be gentle. "Why did you help me?" she asked him once, years in. That first night. "You didn't have to." "Because no one ever helped me," he said. "And I decided that would stop with you." She grew up in that house, fierce and kind and sharp as glass. And Kaito, who had raised no one, raised her without ever quite admitting that was what he was doing. The years were good. That's worth saying, because good years don't always stay. These did, for a long while. She did her homework at a table where deals were struck. She learned to read a room from the best in the city, and was never once asked to be part of what happened in it. Kaito came to her school plays and sat in the back. A feared man, clapping too loud for a girl reciting a poem. He made one rule, and never bent it. She would have nothing to do with the family business. Not one thing. "You came here clean," he told her. "You'll leave clean, and you'll live clean. That's the whole point of you." Then the years did what years do, and jumped. 15 of them. Aoi was 23 now. and she had not spent those years learning the family business. Kaito had refused it. "Not for you," he'd said. "You're going to have a clean life, a real one." So she'd studied. She'd gone to university on his quiet money and become something no one at that gate could have predicted from a girl with a jam jar. She became a lawyer, a very good one. Kaito was proud in a way he didn't have words for. He kept her diploma framed in his study, where the men who'd once laughed at her could see it. He was getting older now. Slower, the empire he'd built was a heavy thing to hold, and there were younger men who had begun, quietly, to circle. Chief among them was Endo. Endo had waited 15 years. He'd smiled and served and bowed, and the whole time he'd been building a way to take everything. And he'd found one. Not with a gun. With paper. He had forged a succession document. A transfer of the family's legitimate holdings, the buildings, the accounts, the clean face of everything Kaito owned, signed, apparently, by Kaito himself, handing control to Endo. He had witnesses he'd bought. He had lawyers he'd paid. And he had timed it for the formal family council. Such matters were settled there, in front of everyone. It was the one place an old man's word could be buried under enough official paper. Kaito saw the trap close and could not stop it. The documents looked real. The witnesses swore to them. In front of the whole assembled family, Endo stood and produced his forgery, and the room began, slowly, to turn toward the winning side, the way rooms do. An old man, outmaneuvered, watched his life's work about to be signed away by a man he'd trusted. And then the door opened, and Iwi walked in. She wore a dark suit now, not a soaked dress. She carried a briefcase, not a jam jar. She walked to the front of that room, the way she'd once walked to Kaito's table at 8 years old, terrified underneath and not showing a single crack of it. She set the briefcase down. She looked at every face in the room. She was not 8 anymore, not soaked, not shaking, not small. She was exactly where 15 years had been leading her, and she was ready. "This document is a forgery," she said. Her voice was steady, and it carried, and I can prove it in about 4 minutes, if the council will give me 4 minutes. Endo laughed, the same laugh from 15 years ago. "And who is this?" "I'm his lawyer," Aoi said. "I'm also the little girl you laughed at the gate 15 years ago. You should have paid more attention to me then. You certainly should have this time." Then, she opened the briefcase. She had everything. She'd been quietly building the case for weeks, the moment she'd sensed the circling. The signature on Endo's document was traced from a real one. She showed the council the original it had been copied from. A forger can reproduce the tremor in a line of ink, but a living hand never repeats it the same way twice. She had the bought witnesses' bank records, timed suspiciously to Endo's accounts. She had the notary's own logbook, which placed Kaito somewhere else entirely on the day he supposedly signed. She laid it out plainly, in short, clear sentences, the way you explain something to people who are half lost and need to follow. She'd learned that skill a long time ago, from a man who listened to an 8-year-old like her words mattered. Piece by piece, in front of the entire family, she took Endo's forgery apart. The room, which had been turning toward Endo, turned all the way around. You could feel it move. The men who'd been ready to bow to him now looked at him differently, like a man who tried to rob a dying king and got caught. In their world, there is no crime more shameful than betraying the Oyabun who raised you. Endo had done it, with forged paper, in the open, in front of everyone who mattered. He had nothing. He'd been unmade by the little girl with the jam jar. "You," Endo started, his voice cracking. "You were nothing." A beggar's child at the gate? I was a child paying her father's debt, Aoi said. And the man you tried to rob is the only person who ever saw that was worth something. He paid my debt with kindness 15 years ago. She looked at Kaito then, and her steady voice went, for just a moment, soft. I came back to pay his. Endo was cast out by the family that same day, stripped of everything, marked as a man who'd betrayed his own father in all but blood. No violence was needed. In that world, the shame was worse than any bullet, and it followed him the rest of his life. Kaito sat in his chair and watched the girl he'd raised save everything he'd built, and he did not have the words. He'd spent his whole life believing softness was a weakness a man like him couldn't afford. The proof that he'd been wrong was standing at the front of the room in a dark suit, having just repaid a jam jar of coins with an entire empire. The last part is small, and it's the part I keep. That night they had dinner, the two of them, the way they had 10,000 times. An old man and the woman who'd once stood in his doorway dripping rainwater. He held his tea in both hands. She poured it, the way she had since she was small. Your father would be proud, Kaito said. I hope you know that. He'd be proud of you, Aoi said. You kept his little girl safe. That was the debt he was really worried about. She smiled. You paid it every single day for 15 years. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just nodded, once, and drank his tea. The city told the story wrong, of course. They said a mafia boss took in a beggar's child and got lucky. Endo's few remaining friends probably still tell it that way, but that's not what happened, and you watched it, so you know. A frightened little girl kept a promise to a dead man and walked into the most dangerous house in the city to do it. She had nothing to give but her courage and a jar of coins. And a hard man looked at that and chose, for once in his life, to be gentle instead of cruel. That one choice, made in a single moment, came back 15 years later and saved everything he was. Kindness is not weakness, and courage is not size. The bravest person in a room is not always the biggest one in it. Sometimes it's a child in the rain, holding a jam jar, keeping a promise no one would have blamed her for breaking. Never laugh at the small one at the gate. You have no idea who she'll grow up to be. If that moved you, tell me the moment it got you, the jar pushed back across the table. I came back to pay his, or the old man's tea at the end. Put it in the comments. Share this with someone who was underestimated when they were small. And if you want the story of who Kaito was before that gate, the life that made him hard, and the debt Aoi's father really owed, vote for part 2 below, and I'll tell you everything.